Good evening and welcome back to Barchester. I apologise for the unanticipated break. Things are just very busy at the moment and it's not easy to read all the time, so I'm sorry. Chapter 15. The Widow's Suitors. Mr. Slope lost no time in availing himself of the bishop's permission to see Mr. Quiverful, and it was in his interview with this worthy pastor that he first learnt that Mrs. Bold was worth the wooing. He rode out to Puddingdale to communicate to the embryo warden the goodwill of the bishop in his favour, and during the discussion on the matter it was not unnatural that the pecuniary resources of Mr. Harding and his family should become the subject of remark. Mr. Quiverful, with his 14 children and his 400 a year, was a very poor man, and the prospect of this new preferment, which was to be held together with his living, was very grateful to him. To what clergyman so circumstanced would not such a prospect be very grateful? But Mr. Quiverful had long been acquainted with Mr. Harding, and had received kindness at his hands, so that his heart misgave him as he thought of supplanting a friend at the hospital. Nevertheless, he was extremely civil, cringingly civil to Mr. Slope, treated him quite as the great man, entreated this great man to do him the honour to drink a glass of sherry, at which, as it was very poor marsala, the now pampered Slope turned up his nose, and ended by declaring his extreme obligation to the bishop and Mr. Slope, and his great desire to accept the hospital if it was certainly the case that Mr. Harding had refused it. What man as needy as Mr. Quiverful would have been more disinterested? "Mr. Harding did positively refuse it," said Mr. Slope, with a certain air of offended dignity, "when he heard of the conditions to which the appointment is now subjected. Of course, you understand, Mr. Quiverful, that the same conditions will be imposed on yourself." Mr. Quiverful cared nothing for the conditions. He would have undertaken to preach any number of sermons Mr. Slope might have chosen to dictate, and to pass every remaining hour of his Sundays within the wall of a Sunday school. What sacrifices, or at any rate what promises, would have been too much to make for such an addition to his income and for such a house? But his mind still recurred to Mr. Harding. "To be sure," said he, "Mr. Harding's daughter is very rich, and why should he trouble himself with the hospital?" "You mean Mrs. Grantly?" said Slope. "I mean his widowed daughter," said the other. "Mrs. Bold has 1200 a year of her own, and I suppose Mr. Harding means to live with her." 1200 a year of her own, said Slope, and very shortly afterwards took his leave, avoiding, as far as it was possible to him to do so, any further allusion to the hospital. 1200 a year, said he to himself, as he rode slowly home. If it were the fact that Mrs. Bold had 1200 a year of her own, what a fool would he be to oppose her father's return to his old place! The train of Mr. Slope's ideas will probably be plain to all my readers. Why should he not make the 1200 a year his own? And if he did so, would it not be well for him to have a father-in-law comfortably provided with the good things of this world? Would it not, moreover, be much more easy for him to gain the daughter, if he did it all in his power to forward the father's views? These questions presented themselves to him in a very forcible way, and yet there were many points of doubt. If he resolved to restore to Mr. Harding his former place, he must take the necessary steps for doing so at once. He must immediately talk over the bishop, quarrel on the matter with Mrs. Proudie, whom he knew he could not talk over, and let Mr. Quiverful know that he had been a little too precipitate as to Mr. Harding's positive refusal. That he could effect all this he did not doubt, but he did not wish to effect it for nothing. He did not wish to give way to Mr. Harding and then be rejected by the daughter. He did not wish to lose one influential friend before he had gained another. And thus he rode home, meditating many things in his mind. It occurred to him that Mrs. Bold was sister-in-law to the Archdeacon, and that not even for 1200 a year would he submit to that imperious man. A rich wife was a great desideratum to him, but success in his profession was still greater. There were, moreover, other rich women who might be willing to become wives. And after all, this 1200 a year might, when inquired into, melt away into some small sum utterly beneath his notice. Then he also remembered that Mrs. Bold had a son. Another circumstance also much influenced him, though it was one which may almost be said to have influenced him against his will. The vision of the Signora Neroni was perpetually before his eyes. It would be too much to say that Mr. Slope was lost in love, but yet he thought and kept continually thinking that he had never seen so beautiful a woman. He was a man whose nature was open to such impulses, and the wiles of the Italianized charmer had been thoroughly successful in imposing upon his thoughts. We will not talk about his heart, not that he had no heart, but because his heart had little to do with his present feelings. His taste had been pleased, his eyes charmed, and his vanity gratified. He had been dazzled by a sort of loveliness which he had never before seen, and had been caught by an easy, free, voluptuous manner which was perfectly new to him. He had never been so tempted before, and the temptation was now irresistible. He had not owned to himself that he cared for this woman more than for others around him, but yet he thought often of the time when he might see her next, and made almost unconsciously little cunning plans for seeing her frequently. He had called at Dr. Stanhope's house the day after the bishop's party, and then the warmth of his admiration had been fed with fresh fuel. If the signora had been kind in her manner and flattering in her speech when lying upon the bishop's sofa with the eyes of so many on her, she had been much more so in her mother's drawing-room, with no one present but her sister to repress either her nature or her art. Mr. Slope had thus left her quite bewildered, and could not willingly admit into his brain any scheme, a part of which would be the necessity of his abandoning all further special friendship with this lady. And so he slowly rode along, very meditative. And here the author must beg it to be remembered that Mr. Slope was not in all things a bad man. His motives, like those of most men, were mixed, and though his conduct was generally very different from that which we would wish to praise, it was actuated perhaps as often as that of the majority of the world by a desire to do his duty. He believed in the religion which he taught, harsh, unpalatable, uncharitable as that religion was. He believed those whom he wished to get under his hoof, the Grantleys and Gwynnes of the church, to be the enemies of that religion. He believed himself to be a pillar of strength, destined to do great things, and with that subtle, selfish, ambiguous sophistry to which the minds of all men are so subject, he had taught himself to think that in doing much for the promotion of his own interest, he was doing much also for the promotion of religion. But Mr. Slope had never been an immoral man. Indeed, he had resisted temptations to immorality with a strength of purpose that was creditable to him. He had early in life devoted himself to works which were not compatible with the ordinary pleasures of youth, and he had abandoned such pleasures not without a struggle. It must therefore be conceived that he did not admit to himself that he warmly admired the beauty of a married woman without heartfelt stings of conscience, and to pacify that conscience he had to teach himself that the nature of his admiration was innocent. And thus he rode along meditative and ill at ease. His conscience had not a word to say against his choosing the widow and her fortune. That he looked upon as a godly work rather than otherwise, as a deed which, if carried through, would redound to his credit as a Christian. On that side lay no future remorse, no conduct which he might probably have to forget, no inward stings. If it should turn out to be really the fact that Mrs. Bold had 1,200 a year at her own disposal, Mr. Slope would rather look upon it as a duty which he owed his religion to make himself the master of the wife and the money, as a duty too in which some amount of self-sacrifice would be necessary. He would have to give up his friendship with the signora, his resistance to Mr. Harding, his antipathy. No, he found on mature self-examination that he could not bring himself to give up his antipathy to Dr. Grantley. He would marry the lady as the enemy of her brother-in-law if such an arrangement suited her. If not, she must look elsewhere for her husband. It was with such a resolve as this that he reached Barchester. He would at once ascertain what the truth might be as to the lady's wealth, and having done this, he would be ruled by circumstances in his conduct respecting the hospital. If he found that he could turn round and secure the place for Mr. Harding without much self-sacrifice, he would do so. But if not, he would woo the daughter in opposition to the father. But in no case would he succumb to the Archdeacon. He saw his horse taken round to the stable, and immediately went forth to commence his inquiries. To give Mr. Slope his credit, he was not a man who ever let much grass grow under his feet. Poor Eleanor! She was doomed to be the intended victim of more schemes than one. About the time that Mr. Slope was visiting the vicar of Puddingdale, A discussion took place respecting her charms and wealth at Dr. Stanhope's house in the Close. There had been morning callers there, and people had told some truth and also some falsehood respecting the property which John Bold had left behind him. By degrees the visitors went, and as the doctor went with them, and as the doctor's wife had not made her appearance, Charlotte Stanhope and her brother were left together. He was sitting idly at the table, scrawling caricatures of Barchester notables, then yawning, then turning over a book or two, and evidently at a loss of how to kill his time without much labour. "You haven't done much, Bertie, about getting any orders," said his sister. "Orders?" said he. "Who on earth is there at Barchester to give one orders? Who among the people here could possibly think it worth his while to have his head done into marble?" "Then you mean to give up your profession?" said she. "No, I don't," said he, going on with some absurd portrait of the bishop. "Look at that, Lotta. Isn't it the little man all over, apron and all? I'd go on with my profession at once, as you call it, if the governor would set me up with a studio in London. But as to sculpture at Barchester, I suppose half the people here don't know what a torso means." "The governor will not give you a shilling to start you in London," said Lotta. "Indeed, he can't give you what would be sufficient, for he has not got it. But you might start yourself very well if you pleased." "How the deuce am I to do it?" said he. "To tell you the truth, Bertie, you'll never make a penny by any profession." "That's what I often think myself," said he, not in the least offended. "Some men have a great gift of making money, but they can't spend it. Others can't put 2 shillings together, but they have a great talent for all sorts of outlay. I begin to think that my genius is wholly in the latter line." "How do you mean to live, then?" asked the sister. "I suppose I must regard myself as a young raven, and look for heavenly manna. Besides, we have all got something when the governor goes." "Yes, you'll have enough to supply yourself with gloves and boots. That is, if the Jews have not got the possession of it all. I believe they have the most of it already. I wonder, Bertie, at your indifference, that you, with your talents and personal advantages, should never try to settle yourself in life. I look forward with dread to the time when the governor must go. Mother and Madeline and I, we shall be poor enough, but you will have absolutely nothing." "Sufficient for the day is the evil thereof," said Bertie. "Will you take my advice?" said his sister. "Cela dépend," said the brother. "Will you marry a wife with money?" "At any rate," said he, "I won't marry one without. Wives with money ain't so easy to get nowadays. The parsons pick 'em all up." "And a parson will pick up the wife I mean for you, if you do not look quickly about it. The wife I mean is Mrs. Bold." "Whew!" whistled Bertie. "A widow!" "She is very beautiful," said Charlotte. "With a son and heir all ready to my hand," said Bertie. "A baby that will very likely die," said Charlotte. "I don't see that," said Bertie. "But however, he may live for me. I don't wish to kill him. Only it must be owned that a ready-made family is a drawback." "There is only one, after all," pleaded Charlotte. "And that a very little one, as the maidservant said," rejoined Bertie. "Beggars mustn't be choosers, Bertie. You can't have everything." "God knows I am not unreasonable," said he, "nor yet opinionated, and if you'll arrange it all for me, Lotta, I'll marry the lady. Only mark this, the money must be sure, and the income at my own disposal, at any rate for the lady's life." Charlotte was explaining to her brother that he must make love for himself if he meant to carry on the matter, and was encouraging him to do so by warm eulogiums on Eleanor's beauty, when the signora was brought into the drawing-room. When at home and subject to the gaze of none but her own family, she allowed herself to be dragged about by 2 persons, and her bearers now deposited her on her sofa. She was not quite so grand in her apparel as she had been at the bishop's party, but yet she was dressed with much care, and though there was a look of care and pain about her eyes, she was, even by daylight, extremely beautiful. "Well, Madeline, so I'm going to be married," Bertie began as soon as the servants had withdrawn. "There's no other foolish thing left that you haven't done," said Madeline, "and therefore you are quite right to try that." "Oh, you think it's a foolish thing, do you?" said he. "There's Lotta advising me to marry by all means, but on such a subject your opinion ought to be the best. You have experience to guide you." "Yes, I have," said Madeline, with a sort of harsh sadness in her tone, which seemed to say, "What is it to you if I am sad? I have never asked for your sympathy." Bertie was sorry when he saw that she was hurt by what he said, and he came and squatted on the floor close before her face to make his peace with her. "Come, Mad, I was only joking. You know that. But in sober earnest, Lotta is advising me to marry. She wants me to marry this Mrs. Bold. She's a widow, with lots of tin, a fine baby, a beautiful collection, and the George and Dragon Hotel up in the High Street. By Jove, Lotta, if I marry her, I'll keep the public house myself. It's just the life to suit me." "What?" said Madeline. "That vapid, swarthy creature in the widow's cap, who looked as though her clothes had been stuck on her back with a pitchfork." The signora never allowed any woman to be beautiful. "Instead of being vapid," said Lotta, "I call her a very lovely woman. She was by far the loveliest woman in the rooms the other night, that is, excepting you, Madeline." Even the compliment did not soften the asperity of the maimed beauty. "Every woman is charming according to Lotta," she said. "I never knew an eye with so little true appreciation. In the first place, what woman on earth could look well in such a thing as that she has on her head? Of course she wears a widow's cap, but she'll put that off when Bertie marries her." "I don't see any of course in it," said Madeline. "The death of 20 husbands should not make me undergo such a penance. It is as much a relic of paganism as the sacrifice of a Hindu woman at the burning of her husband's body. If not so bloody, it is quite as barbarous, and quite as useless." "But you don't blame her for that," said Bertie. "She does it because it's the custom of the country. People would think ill of her if she didn't do it." "Exactly," said Madeline. "She is just one of those English nonentities who would tie her head up in a bag for 3 months every summer, if her mother and her grandmother had tied up their heads before her. It would never occur to her to think whether there was any use in submitting to such a nuisance." "It is very hard in a country like England for a young woman to set herself in opposition to prejudices of that sort," said the prudent Charlotte. "What you mean is that it's very hard for a fool not to be a fool," said Madeline. Bertie Stanhope had been so knocked about the world from his earliest years that he had not retained much respect for the gravity of English customs. But even to his mind an idea presented itself, that perhaps in a wife true British prejudice would not in the long run be less agreeable than Anglo-Italian freedom from restraint. He did not exactly say so, but he expressed the idea in another way. "I fancy," said he, "that if I were to die and then walk, I should think that my widow looked better in one of those caps than any other kind of headdress." "Yes, and you'd fancy also that she could do nothing better than shut herself up and cry for you, or else burn herself. But she would think differently. She'd probably wear one of those horrid she-helmets, because she'd want the courage not to do so. But she'd wear it with a heart longing for the time when she might be allowed to throw it off. I hate such shallow, false pretences. For my part, I would let the world say what it pleased, and show no grief if I felt none, and perhaps not if I did." "But wearing a widow's cap won't lessen her fortune," said Charlotte. "Or increase it," said Madeline. "Then why on earth does she do it?" "But Lotta's object is to make her put it off," said Bertie. "If it be true that she has got 1200 a year quite at her own disposal, and she be not utterly vulgar in her manners, I would advise you to marry her. I dare say she is to be had for the asking, and as you are not going to marry her for love, it doesn't much matter whether she is good-looking or not. As to your really marrying a woman for love, I don't believe you are a fool enough for that." "Oh, Madeline!" exclaimed her sister. "And oh, Charlotte!" said the other. "You don't mean to say that no man can love a woman unless he be a fool?" "I mean very much the same thing. That any man who is willing to sacrifice his interest to get possession of a pretty face is a fool. Pretty faces are to be had cheaper than that. I hate your mawkish sentimentality, Lotta. You know as well as I do in what ways husbands and wives generally live together. You know how far the warmth of conjugal affection can withstand the trial of a bad dinner, of a rainy day, or of the least privation which poverty brings with it. You know what freedom a man claims to himself, what slavery he would exact from his wife if he could. And you know also how wives generally obey. Marriage means tyranny on one side and deceit on the other. I say that a man is a fool to sacrifice his interests for such a bargain. A woman, too, generally has no other way of living." "But But Bertie has no other way of living, said Charlotte. Then in God's name let him marry Mrs. Bold, said Madeline. And so it was settled between them. But let the gentle-hearted reader be under no apprehension whatsoever. It is not destined that Eleanor should marry Mr. Slope or Bertie Stanhope. And here perhaps it may be allowed to the novelist to explain his views on a very important point in the art of telling tales. He ventures to reprobate that system which goes so far to violate all proper confidence between the author and his readers, by maintaining nearly to the end of the 3rd volume a mystery as to the fate of their favourite personage. Nay, more, and worse than this, is too frequently done. Have not the profoundest efforts of genius been used to baffle the aspirations of the reader, to raise false hopes and false fears, and to give rise to expectations which are never to be realised? Are not promises all but made of delightful horrors, in view of which the writer produces nothing but most commonplace realities in his final chapter? And is there not a species of deceit in this, to which the honesty of the present age should let no countenance? And what can be the worth of that solicitude which a peep into the 3rd volume can utterly dissipate? What the value of those literary charms which are absolutely destroyed by their enjoyment? When we have once learnt what was that picture before which was hung Mrs. Radcliffe's solemn curtain, we feel no further interest about either the frame or the veil. They are to us merely a receptacle for old bones, an inappropriate coffin, which we would wish to have decently buried out of our sight. And then how grievous a thing it is to have the pleasure of your novel destroyed by the ill-considered triumph of a previous reader. Oh, you needn't be alarmed for Augusta. Of course she accepts Gustavus in the end. How very ill-natured you are, Susan, says Kitty, with tears in her eyes. I don't care a bit about it now. Dear Kitty, if you will read my book, you may defy the ill nature of your sister. There shall be no secret that she can tell. Nay, take the last chapter, if you please. Learn from its pages all the results of our troubled story, and the story shall have lost none of its interest, if indeed there is any interest in it to lose. Our doctrine is, that the author and the reader should move along together in full confidence with each other. Let the personages of the drama undergo ever so complete a comedy of errors among themselves, but let the spectator never mistake the Syracusan for the Ephesian. Otherwise he is one of the dupes, and the part of the dupe is never dignified. I would not for the value of this chapter have it believed by a single reader that my Eleanor could bring herself to marry Mr. Slope, or that she should be sacrificed to a Bertie Stanhope. But among the good folk of Barchester, many believed both the one and the other. Well, I have to say I did not expect such a conversation between author and reader at the end. How very interesting. Again, I'm drawn to thinking about classical stories where the suspense is not about what will happen, but how it will happen, and the emotions that you feel when it does. And I think that's something similar to what Trollope is saying. It's a different kind of suspense, and how nice to have a conversation with an author. Have a good evening.